the question was, is there, and tell me if I'm getting this right, is there some kind of platform that you can use to be able to plug in different security solutions so that you have a more holistic type of approach to security as opposed to something you have to bake in yourself? And the second part was, how can you tell whether or not a security deployment is going to have secondary effects in terms of creating new security holes in your system? Is that about correct? So, to the first part of it, I think that you do want to do both. You do want to create an application which is inherently as secure as possible from the point of view of its architecture. You don't want to create something which introduces vulnerabilities in terms of its general design. So you want to be thinking about security from the very beginning, and I am a big believer in as much security education as possible, but on the part of developers. But at the same time, that's not enough, and you can't expect that the vast majority of developers are going to be able to have the same level of security knowledge as security professionals. So I think that you also have to come in and have things like security reviews. Like we had, in an organization at the scale of Google, you can have a dedicated security team that spends its time consulting with other teams and making sure that they are performant when it comes to the security of any new applications. But for other organizations, I think that that's where the opportunity is created for third-party security organizations to be able to come in and add that industry-specific knowledge. As far as the secondary effects of security deployments, I think that that's part of that expertise. When an organization that has seen security technologies deployed in many different contexts is able to come into your organization, or the security team in your organization consults to another team, that's where they have to bring in that experience and say that these are some of the secondary effects that we've seen and here's how you mitigate them.
I want to maybe add a little bit that there are platforms out there that enable you to help you identify secure or insecure coding. There are platforms out there that enable you to identify patching issues. And so the combination together allows you to do something about it. The challenge is those things, as been said here, security is kind of bolted on. It's not even something that's important when you study coding. Maybe the last page on your Java book is about secure coding. It's not something that is being taught. We've had a lot of conversation. There's an organization, Bay Area Council, and we had a lot of conversation there about trying to get security as part of our training. How do you bring developers that understand security from the beginning? That's a big deal. That's a big deal. That's half the battle right there. How do you build it into your process that it's not the end, leap, this is the last hurdle to leap over it? How do you build it so that it's part of what you do day to day? And I have to say, we have we have significant web presence. I'm proud to say that we've been able to integrate it into our process up front. There's ways of doing that.
And it's kind of funny. I have an odd viewpoint on this, in that we've taught security in our books. Actually, there's this book that I quote a lot. There's this book called Security, Accuracy, and Privacy in Computer Systems. It was written by James Martin in 1975. And it was all about securing and validating input, making sure that you have right secure code, all of these things throughout the years. That when you go through these old programming books where they talk about it, the biggest problem is developers just don't like doing it. It's just not a fun thing to do. And I think actually what will change is there are secure platforms, but it's not because of security for security's sake. It's security for technology advancement's sake. So if you look at the .NET framework, or you look at these frameworks like Rails or whatever, these types of things, these are technology platforms or development platforms that are being built in order to make developers' lives easier, right? So I can code to this thing. The fact that they then start building security into that framework then all of a sudden eliminates a lot of security vulnerabilities. So way back in the day, it was maybe 2003 or something, .NET made this decision that said by default, cross-site scripting is not allowed in their framework, right? And all of a sudden, the cross-site scripting in .NET just dropped significantly because, to your point, the default was built in. So then all of a sudden the framework and the language became more secure, not because the developer wanted to make it more secure, because they built it into the framework, which developers love using because of the advancement of the technology. So I think you start seeing a lot of that kind of happen there. Now the security impact of that is, let's say I decide to use a single framework, which does help me, one, control my quality of code, helps me control what kind of built-in things I put in security. But the second thing is the impact of that. What other security issues does that affect? And so then you could say, let's look at .NET framework. Well, if you standardize on that .NET framework, any vulnerability that comes out in .NET framework, then you're susceptible to. But I would much rather deal with that, because if I'm up to date on my patches, then it's easy to fix in a one-time area versus having to deal with lots of components all over your code. Now, your question, I think, was more code development specific, but really your question can be genericized across all areas, including networking or IP and all these types of things. But in code specifically, it's sort of my viewpoint on it.
So earlier, you guys all shared this conversation around lack of sharing of information amongst the technology vendors, right, that exist. And on the other hand, we also talked about consumers are asked to share a lot of their personal information. So I think that, as a consumer, I bank with Wells Fargo, and I thank you for all the effort that's put in that. But I'm finding that the consumers, you're asked to put a lot of ourselves into it to get perhaps a false sense of security. I'm being asked now if I want to change something in my account to divulge my PIN number, whereas before it wasn't. I'm being asked by providing the last 4 digits of my social. When I do shopping, I'm being asked for my CVV numbers. And I'm trusting the technology vendors out there to do due diligence and do care. That's the limit that I can only get, right? Because technology, you're not expected to do a validation or anything beyond that. All you're required is to do due diligence and do care, and the buck stops there. And you've done it, that's fine. The question is, what is it that we can do for the technology itself, particularly security, to share more intelligence? So something happens in Wells Fargo, Bank of America learns about it, and so on and so forth, right? So we feel that at least if I provide that much information to you, that I get a better sense of security back. The question I have for you is, how many of you actually participate in information sharing like ISAC, like there's FS ISAC, IT ISAC? What do you feel about that? And do we have a hope that that's going to happen?
So the question is, who participates in information sharing, and
right.
Do we have the hope that it will continue and happen?
Every big bank participates in information sharing. Every big web company participates in information sharing. Some of that information sharing is formal, some of it's informal. It goes on right now as we speak. There are very active mailing lists that are talking about the threats that are going on. As a small company, you don't get invited into those lists because part of that is trust. As you go through your own wars, you get invited in. And we're invited as CloudFlare into many, but probably not all. And I think these are informal relationships, and they're hard to make them formal, and sometimes making them formal kills them.
Is it working? Do you feel that?
Yes.
I would contradict a little bit to say that we are participating in FS-ISAC, and DDoS is the primary sharing of information. I think when it comes to consumer fraud, it's a little bit more iffy. People are reluctant, and there are legal ramifications to that. It has not been as successful as we'd like to. There are private companies that enable such information sharing in a way that's anonymous. There's also private companies that scour the web and find what's out there and share that with us back. So we use all of those venues. But I can imagine that some regulation would help with that.
I think one of the particularly challenging concepts that you touched on is the relationship between security and privacy. So there's a real limit to how much any given organization can share about one of their users with external organizations. So at Google, there would be all kinds of information that Google would know about the behavior of a given IP address, which could be used for fraud purposes within the company, but that information can't leave Google to be shared with someone else to be interpreted in their statistical anomaly detection model. So just because Google is aware of the fact that this IP address, in addition to clicking on certain ads, also searched for certain terms, doesn't necessarily mean that that information can be shared with an external organization, and you wouldn't want that to happen either. And that's the same for basically every single organization that has any significant amount of data about a user or a machine or an IP address. So I think that the challenge is figuring out acceptable ways to be able to share information, but while also preserving the privacy of users from the point of view of not only information sharing, but also data storage. So you were mentioning before, how do you know that all of this information that you're providing to a bank, sometimes reluctantly, you prefer that the bank not necessarily have all of that information about you. How do you know that it's being stored properly and safely? And one of the ways that you can mitigate any risk of improper or unsafe storage is by only storing as much data as you need to. So for anyone that is creating a new consumer web application that's going to be collecting end user data, I would strongly recommend that you think very hard about how much data you really need from users and only store that minimum amount, because that will solve a lot of problems for you down the road.
I also think the push for mobile and sort of a lot of the technology advancements, if you think in the next 5 years, I think a lot of that stuff will end up going away. So that you won't have to be prompted every single time you do things. There are going to be better ways to validate you, better ways to identify you, and all that stuff will start disappearing.
Yes.
One of the panelists was saying that cybersecurity now is kind of like an arms race. And as a former scholar of the Soviet Union, I'm not sure I agree, because during the arms race, we were building nukes, they were building nukes, offense. Whereas in cybersecurity, it seems that you guys are building walls and they're building taller ladders. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what deterrence we have out there. Like, this is a big topic right now. The federal government likes to build stuff that can kill people or hurt them. So on the federal level, is there some sort of localized electromagnetic pulse that can fry, like the circuitry of a hacker? And on the personal level, like what kind of stuff do you guys have, or what do you wish that you could have?
Okay, so I think I was the one who said that. So I'd say one thing. One, I said that generically, not technically. But I would also put out the option that don't be fooled. There absolutely is a lot of offense from us. So there is a lot of defense for these guys too. So if you really want to be technical, yes, it is an actual arms race. But I just made that statement just generically.
So that's a hot topic right now, and there are a bunch of startups that are working on that, talk about offensive security. And I guess the cautionary tale that I would tell is about a company called Blue Security. Blue Security was an anti-spam company. It was really hot around circa 2005. And it had a really simple premise, which was you'd install a little Outlook plugin, and everyone who installed the Outlook plugin, when you clicked on "this is spam," it would essentially get all of the other Outlook plugins to simultaneously visit any links that were included in the email message that was received, effectively denial of service attacking the spammer, which was offensive technology. The company mysteriously shut down a little bit later and this is somewhat, bad things happened. Some of the investors got threatening letters targeting some of their family. Some of the bad guys here are real cyber criminals, and they are people who their livelihood depends on committing crime. And if their livelihood depends on committing crime, then frankly, I'm a really soft target. Ray Rothrock, who's an investor in CloudFlare, an investor in Shape Security, very first meeting we had, very first question he asked me was, what are you going to do when you get the first death threat? And we get death threats all the time. And the only thing I have in common with Justin Timberlake is that we've both been swatted. This stuff happens and you become a target. And if you are being truly offensive, and a lot of people talk about it, we do all kinds of things to slow down attacks, and that's not offensive. If you are striking back against them, then just be prepared, because the real true criminals can hurt you in ways that you just don't anticipate.
I think the bottom line is prosecution, and I think we're getting better at it. The challenge is geographically, it can happen from anywhere. There are places where, like Albania is an example, there are no wire fraud legislation. So how do you work with government? And I think we're getting much better at it, to be honest with you. And you can see with this recent $45 million haste that people are getting arrested all over the place.
Yeah, and that's actually, so like this, we sat in front of the Spam House, DDoS, 300 gigabits, big attack. What was pretty impressive was the FBI, in a coordinated, multi-jurisdictional effort, arrested 6 people. Only one has been reported, but there's 6 involved. There were a bunch of people who were involved with the attack very shortly, I mean, within a month and a half after the attack happening. So I think law enforcement is starting to catch up with that, and true offensive measures, personally, I would leave to the government.
Yes.
Are you looking at the emerging failure of the CA infrastructure? Like, anyone can get a cert for anything these days? Because, hey, you can say you have that IP address.
Yeah, so there are 2 problems. So this question is, are we looking at the emerging failure of the CA infrastructure? I think that there are 2 failures of the CA infrastructure. One is anyone can get a cert for anything, and so I can pretend to be Google or Bank of America or anything like that. That's problem 1. Problem 2 is it's actually too hard for small individual companies to get and manage their certificates. It's that we've designed a system that's too easy for the bad guys and too hard for the good guys. And so I mean, I think there are efforts on both sides of that. I was just meeting with the folks over at Artemis yesterday who are doing .secure. They've got some really interesting ideas on how to create a truly secure CA system. But on the other side, I think that it's, what we're really working on is not how to fix the CA system to make sure people don't spoof Google, but quite the opposite. How do we make sure that, the 1 million websites, there are only 2 million SSL secured, so the little lock that appears in your browser, only 2 million SSL secured websites on the internet. That's pathetic. And so, we're trying to figure out, is there a way that we can enable at least basic SSL protection for every one of our websites instantaneously, and that's technically very hard, and there are lots of reasons that that's challenging. But if I'm